Hey everyone, welcome to the Ministry Show. We have a great show lined up today talking about orientation. And orientation is something that when you provide an excellent orientation, you're showing honor and respect to your volunteers. You're empowering them, and that's what we want to do. Our show outline today is right here for you. And I have a feeling that Chris just might jump on a soapbox. I just had that feeling.
Okay, Pam. Well, I hope I don't jump on it too much, but as I mentioned in the last show, I really believe that orientation training is the most important training that you'll ever do in ministry. And so we want to make sure that we concentrate on it, give it its due notice. And so why do I think that? Well, when you train ahead of time, it is a positive investment, one of not only respect, but also honoring to volunteers that have said yes to you. But when you train behind time, that's correction in ministry. And I've learned a long time ago that if I'm investing in my volunteers, if I'm investing in my staff, I get a great return. But when I have to be in correction mode, there's tension around that, at least. And then sometimes it takes a little bit of time to get back on kilter. That's why I think this orientation training is so vital to you having a thriving ministry and having a year that is just the best one that you've ever had. If you'll take a moment with me, I want you to just close your eyes for a second and remember back to when you first started in ministry. Now, for some of you, you might have been 4 or 5 years old because you grew up in the church, but think of a new ministry that you started in where you didn't know for sure what was happening. Maybe you didn't know why it was important, and you weren't real familiar with how to get it done. For some of you that are listening, that'll be like when you were a teenager, maybe a young adult, or maybe even later than that. So close your eyes and think through this. How nervous were you? What was going on in your mind? What questions came to your mind? What was in your heart at that point? Taking a step into ministry, especially a ministry that you're not familiar with yet or that's a new move for you, gives the devil a playing field that can really wreak havoc with people. And so it's our job as pastors and church leaders to make sure we understand the mindset and the heart set of the people that are entering into ministry. Again, for us, it might seem super simple because we're dealing with volunteers and nursery and greeters and small group leaders and worship volunteers throughout the week, throughout the month, throughout the year. But when you take a moment and remember when, you can have that empathy that will help you design an orientation training that's really from your heart. And when you do that, you make connections with people that you've already recruited that will be probably lifelong connections for you. So it's super important. If we want our volunteers to last long term, we want to give them the best start possible. Let me ask you this question. How many of you had a brilliant first date? I sure didn't. I mean, I can't remember how old I was. I think 33. No, just kidding. I was a teenager and all that. I was nervous as could be. I think I tried to wear my dad's shoes or something like that were too big for my feet. I was an awkward thing. And sometimes for people in ministry, putting that ministry suit on, so to speak, is an awkward thing. So when we think orientation training as it relates to our volunteers, the sequence is super important. Never, and I know I'm using that word, this is a soapbox thing, never let somebody start in ministry before you orient them to your ministry, ever. Well, the value here comes from put the needs and interests of others above your own. When you do that, the connection that happens, even though, again, it's very simple for you, it's like, oh, I have to train in another usher or whatever. You have that time to connect, and you're really putting their needs, wants, interests, and calming their, if they have any anxiety, if they have any fear, you help calm that fear. Do orientation, again, before they start, not a year later. In that orientation, here's a couple things. We need to explain the why. Why does this ministry exist? Why does this role exist? And why are you part of this ministry? If we can reinforce that for people, it helps immensely. So I'm going to go back to the standard one. We have a lot of people in ministry, in hospitality ministry. So why do we do the hospitality ministry at First Church? Well, you need to explain that. Maybe it's like, have you noticed in our culture that hospitality right now is very important? I mean, whether you're going to a restaurant, a mall, heck, even Walmart has a greeter. That's a cultural thing that hospitality has risen to different heights. So we want to be hospitable in our environment. That's the reason why this ministry exists. Why you're part of this ministry is because you have a very approachable countenance. And I've heard from not only others, but as you and I talked during our recruiting conversation, I could really tell that you care about others having a successful experience here at First Church. So I just want to touch on that, explain the reason why not only this ministry exists at the church, but why they were selected to be part of that ministry. And then the second part of orientation training is this: we need to reveal our expectations right up front. Some of you are going, I don't know what I'm supposed to expect. Yeah. Or a question I get often when I'm coaching pastors and church leaders is this expectation reasonable? Those are things that you have to decide ahead of time. And before you can do a good job at orientation training, you need to feel comfortable about your expectations as they relate to the role, the responsibility of that role, the outcome that you're looking for, and the boundaries that exist. Let me work this one backwards just a little bit. The boundaries might be a time boundary, 20 minutes before to 20 minutes after the service start time. A boundary might be something having to do with their dress or their appearance. A boundary might be their language. I'll give you one that was part of my training years and years ago. I was at a church that had an extremely long walkway to the front door, from the parking lot to the front door. So one of the boundaries that we had to instill for both men and women is, for the men, don't lock eyes with a lady that's walking down, because that's going to make them feel uncomfortable. And the same thing with the ladies that were greeters. Don't lock eyes with a guy that's coming down that walkway. And it was really interesting because these people want to be friendly and notice people and all that. But if somebody's walking down that was almost kind of like an aisle, it was important to notice them, but then divert their eye contact. That's just an example, but you need to think through the boundaries, the outcomes that you want. I like to put my mindset in, man, after somebody engaged with one of our people in hospitality, what would I want them to say to their friend who they just met up with? Oh my goodness, that lady at the front door was so gracious, or that gentleman helped me find a way, or whatever it might be. Well, those are outcomes that we want. The responsibility of it, whether it's man the post, one of the responsibilities with hospitality people is, this is not the time for you to engage with your friends about what you're doing after church, because we have to pay attention to those that are coming in. So those are just some ideas around one role, but you have to do it for all the different roles that you're responsible for in your ministry. Kind of already alluded to this, but there are different roles and different responsibilities depending upon your church, your own church polity, and really what you want your outcome to be.
Yeah, and those expectations need to be clearly communicated up front. Like we've talked about before, we've both been in ministry where we didn't have an orientation, we didn't have training, and it causes confusion. We can't hold people accountable if they don't know what they're accountable to. I know one of the things that I heard over and over in ministry was dress code for worship. Because they didn't orientate their worship team members, a dress may look great. A dress code, especially with females, may look great on a flat floor. You come into the church, but when you get on those stages that are a little higher, changes the whole view. That's something that you want to be aware of. Make sure that when you're training, you're communicating. Hey guys, think about when you're up on the stage, what's your dress code going to look like? Or what are some things to be aware of? Another thing is smoking on campus. Some churches allow that, some don't. So communicate that. If you're a non-smoking campus, make sure you communicate that out front so that people know when you're here at church, try not to do that.
Pam, did I ever tell you about the guy that was overseeing a pretty large ministry at North Coast that was a tobacco user? Did I ever tell you about that?
I don't know if you did.
Oh, it was so funny.
I love your stories.
I was asked to come in and help organize a certain specific ministry, which I was happy to do. So I met with the volunteer leader of that ministry, who reported prior to somebody else, but I had been asked to step in. So I'll call him Matt. So I had a meeting with Matt. The entire time that I was talking with Matt, this was before the service now. So Matt had a cup in his hand, but the cup wasn't full. He was filling the cup. Do you know what I mean? You don't know what I mean. So he was a tobacco chew guy. Yeah. And our campus was a non-tobacco campus. I was a little bit confused, but brand new to this person. So I went to the other ministry head that I was taking over from after the conversation. I'm like, have you noticed that Matt is a tobacco guy? He's like, well, what do you mean? Well, he chews tobacco, and he's got the cup and he's spitting in. I had to then go back to Matt and kind of correct, which is not a fun thing to do in ministry. In the orientation, if you're a non-tobacco campus, this would be an example of he wasn't oriented properly to the ministry at the very beginning. And so there were some habits that were not really what we wanted that extended down that line. So it really is important, even if you think it's kind of a weird thing to mention, especially in our culture today, because most of our churches have people coming from all kinds of backgrounds, various lifestyles, and so on. Be clear about your expectations, but you have to identify them up front. Before we go on, let me mention there are some problems with expectations. I'm not talking about preferences. I'm talking about expectations that are held and adhered to by the overall church. I have certain preferences that if I could, I would inflict upon people. That's not smart. So we have to come up with the expectations, not the preferences. If we turn our preferences into expectations, what tends to happen is we get a laundry list that we call expectations, but they're really preferences. That list gets so long that we end up alienating people right from the start. So make sure they're really expectations that have to do with the role and responsibility, outcomes and boundaries that you have, and limit it to that. If our expectations are too numerous, then kind of nobody can qualify, or they might not want to really be a part of that. Am I being clear? I'm not sure.
No, it does. What would you say to someone who maybe has never done orientation before and they're starting to think about this? What is kind of the medium expectations? Do you have that? Like 50 is way too many.
Well, yeah, that's a great question, Pam. I like to limit the expectations to the minimum number possible. Okay. So if I really care about it and we really do have this outcome in mind, then it requires this to be an expectation. Like, for example, I'll pick the one that is the hot one all around the country, show up on time.
Right.
I didn't ever have a problem with people showing up on time. Clearly, things happen and people are late once in a while. But by and large, in general, because we revealed it as an expectation right up front, people showed up on time. Mm-hmm. Well, that saves a lot of heartache in ministry when people show up on time. I don't have to wonder. My mind doesn't wander. Did they get hurt? Do they have a flat tire somewhere? How can I help them? Because they would show up on time. But that was part of the orientation training.
I like that. Because you're looking at the outcome and then you're working back rather than having a list of rules.
Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah. And so it really is around role, responsibility, outcomes, and boundaries, not, man, I wish people would fill in the blank.
Right.
They vary by ministry too, but we won't get into that right now. We do have some broad expectations. I think it's important to reveal those as well. Sometimes we have broad expectations that we think everybody knows about, so it doesn't make the list. There's one that you can see there, the broad expectation of, in children's ministry, the safety of the child is paramount. Mm-hmm. Today, that might be noted in your church or where you're from, but I can tell you probably 25, 30% of the churches that I consult with or coach, they're like, oh, really? That's an issue?
Number one in children's ministry.
Yeah. And of course, when I started in ministry, that wasn't even on the radar. The pendulum has swung, but there are still people that can come into your ministry that might not be aware that that's paramount. Make sure you let them know that it is paramount. Usually orientation is done in some kind of a meeting format, but you can also do orientation on the job. If you match people up with somebody that already knows the role and responsibility, they can help lighten your load because they know the job probably better than you because they do it week in and week out, or 2 weeks on or 2 weeks off. But a great way to orient people to their ministry role is just hook them up with somebody that's already doing it. Maybe hook up for like a month so that's 4 Sundays. Well, by the time that's done, they're going to be oriented. So it's not just one way to do orientation.
Right. So I love having mentors that Just take them under their wing and show them the ropes.
So here's the action item then for this week. Review your orientation training, and does your orientation training currently provide clear expectations, the boundaries that are necessary, the action steps for success in that particular role? And then this is one we didn't talk about, but who do you call when you have either a problem you can't solve or a set of circumstances that's unfamiliar to them? Great way to make sure that people aren't always calling you and that you can get restful night's sleep so they can call somebody. They don't necessarily have to call you.
Yeah, we covered that also in orientation. I'd have everybody pull up their cell phone. Here's your team lead, put their number in so that they have that. So orientation is vital because it's important information that's shared, and also it's a place where volunteers can ask questions. You hear other people asking a question, like, okay, I don't feel so dumb asking that question, you know? So it creates great dialogue. Or someone asks the question that you're thinking, and it gets answered for you. So.
Now, we're getting a question over and over again about, hey, I thought this was a 30-minute show. It's only going around 20 minutes. So why is that? Well, here's the reason why. These action items, we want you to take the time to look at and interact with that action item for the 5 or 10 minutes following the show. And we know that your time is valuable, so we don't want to ask you for 10 more minutes. Where the content part of the show is about 20, maybe 17 to 22 minutes. And then interact with the action item, at least jot a few notes down and make sure that you're interacting with that. Clear expectation, boundaries, and so on. Now, skipping to next week, here's what's going to happen. We're going to talk about ongoing training because ultimately our job is to make disciples. And that requires a large and hefty investment over time, especially with adults. So we're going to get into that ongoing training next week. So, hey, as we wrap up this edition of the Ministry Show, I just want to draw your attention to our sponsors. You can see them there. This wouldn't be happening without them. And so if you have a need in one of these areas, please go ahead and click on that link. You can find out about our sponsors. And until next week, God bless.